which is a nonprofit organization actively engaged in seeking land use regulatory reform and protecting private property rights. OIA is the largest grassroots private property rights organization in the nation. Many of you may have heard about Oregonians in action during the 1994 U.S. Supreme Court case of Dolan versus the City of Tigard. OAI staff attorneys successfully represented the Dolans in that case and were the attorneys that presented oral argument before the Supreme Court. Mr. George was raised on a farm in rural Yamhill County, and he tells me he's still very active in that farming operation. He graduated from Oregon State University with bachelor's degrees in international finance and political science. He has appeared on many talk radio shows, including Pat Buchanan's Crossfire program, broadcast from Washington, D.C. He recently participated in a discussion meet in St. Louis where he was awarded a new truck for his speaking ability on current issues affecting agriculture. Unfortunately, we don't have any such prize to offer you here today, but we'll look forward to your remarks. Robert Liberty received his bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Oregon. He was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and graduated from Harvard Law School. He's been associated with 1,000 Friends of Oregon in various capacities since 1981 and presently serves as its executive director. Now, founded in 1975, 1,000 Friends has been an advocate for planning and managed growth. Its attorneys and planners have worked to oppose urban sprawl and promote livable communities while protecting farm and forest lands and natural resources. 1,000 Friends actually now has grown up to over 4,000, with its membership doubling in the past year under Mr. Liberty's leadership. While he was 1,000 Friends' lead attorney in the 1980s, Mr. Liberty was often criticized by local officials for his take-no-prisoners approach to land use cases. But he was successful in winning 3/4 of the more than 100 cases that he took on during that period. Now he's spending most of his time trying to head off more than a dozen bills that would amend Oregon's 1973 land use law and make it easier to develop rural land. Our speakers will each give a 15-minute presentation on 3 topics. The 3 topics are protection of our farms and forests, urban growth management, and compensation and taking. After those presentations, we will then be able to ask questions. The first speaker will be Larry George.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the City Club for having us here today to speak about one of the most important issues facing Oregonians, the future of our state. I want to assure you that both Oregonians in Action and 1,000 Friends of Oregon share the same goal. That is, the protection of the livability of our state. I would like to start by telling you a little bit about myself. I was raised on a family filbert farm in Yamhill County. Basically, I grew up a country boy, working long, dusty days, driving tractor and piling brush. I'd like to still be there, except I've been dragged into this debate. In my mind, I know what makes Oregon the place I want to live and eventually raise my family. It's a rural life in Oregon. As I grew older, I found that other Oregonians love this state as much as I do, but for a variety of different reasons. Some Oregonians live and love the active downtown life of Portland. Others love quiet neighborhoods where they feel a sense of community. And still others find their quality of life in a place called Diamond in rural Harney County. Every Oregonian has their vision. Every Oregonian has their quality of life. And every Oregonian has their own piece of Eden. Our challenge today is to fit these pieces together. Oregonians in Action, as a land use nonprofit organization, got underway 6 years ago under the leadership of Frank Nims and Bill Moshofsky. It was founded for one simple reason. Frank and Bill believed that the Land Conservation Development Commission, LCDC, had installed a highly restrictive land use regulatory system that was unfair, unjust, inflexible, and sometimes unconstitutional. When Bill and Frank started OIA 6 years ago, they did it with the help of a few hundred supporters. Today, just 6 years later, we have literally thousands of supporters across the state, which brings me to an interesting question. Why? Why has Oregonians in Action grown from a few hundred supporters to thousands? Is it because of the hard work of Bill and Frank and what they've put into the organization? Partly yes. But nonprofits organizations do not experience this kind of growth simply because of the hard work of a couple volunteers. Instead, Oregonians in Action has grown because thousands of Oregonians now believe what Bill and Frank first believed, that Oregon's land use planning system has strayed far from its original mission that Tom McCall, Hector McPherson, L.B. Day first envisioned in Senate Bill 100 in 1973. It has become simply too bureaucratic, too callous, and too inflexible towards the property rights of individual Oregonians. But our members are not the only ones who have witnessed our extraordinary growth. Of course, the press has seen it. In the last 3 weeks, no less, a half a dozen editorials and columns have appeared in the Oregonian attacking OIA and our bills before the legislature. I don't believe I'm exaggerating when I say the media has not exactly treated us with kid gloves. Quite to the contrary. We've been accused of wanting to gut Oregon's progressive land use planning system. One Oregonian columnist, Jonathan Nichols, even went so far to call us a bunch of weasels. Weasels who want to destroy everything our state holds sacred. Now that's tough talk. But I'm here to tell you it's simply not true. In addition, they have attempted to say that we are backed by big money and that we are not a grassroots organization, implying that we really don't represent the family landowner. Again, this isn't true. You only need to look at our budget. Our budget was just over $300,000 last year. By any definition you use, our funding base is grassroots, about as grassroots as you can possibly get, actually. For those of you who are truly interested in where OIA and who supports Oregonians in Action, you simply need to walk into the Secretary of State's office and look up the records of the Oregonians in Action Political Action Committee. You will find that we are backed by farmers, ranchers, small business owners, some city folks, and perhaps the group that's been damaged the most by Oregon's land use laws, retirees. Some would say that we're out of the mainstream, which brings me to another interesting question. What is the mainstream? Was it out of the mainstream for Oregonians in Action to help the Dolans of Tigard defend their property rights before the nation's highest court? Last year, Oregonians in Action received a great deal of attention from across the country when we argued and won Florence Dolan's case before the U.S. Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., a case which many consider the most important private property rights case in the last 50 years. As many of you know, the Dolan family wanted to expand their plumbing store in downtown Tigard. They were told by city officials that they would have their permit only if they gave up land for the city to use as a bike path. Now, I want to make the situation perfectly clear. Oregonians in Action and the Dolans lost before the Land Use Board of Appeals, before the State Court of Appeals, and lost before our state Supreme Court here in the state of Oregon 6-1. What did our opponents say? Our opponents at the time, including 1,000 Friends, said that Oregonians in Action was out of the mainstream. But the U.S. Supreme Court disagreed. The U.S. Supreme Court said, and I quote, "The court sees no reasons why property rights should be relegated to the status of a poor relation to other civil rights," unquote. But the court didn't stop there. It went on to say that the principal purpose of the Takings Clause of the United States Constitution is to bar government from forcing some people alone to bear the burdens which, in all fairness, should be borne by the public as a whole. That has been our point all along. If the community wants to impose special restrictions on private property rights to provide public benefits, that's fine with us. We've never had a problem with those kind of regulations. But the community should, in all fairness, pay the cost. The Supreme Court is saying something very important, and I want to make this really the key here. Planning and property rights are not mutually exclusive. You can do both, you can have them at the same time. Contrary to what 1,000 Friends claimed in their brief to the United States Supreme Court, the Dolan case has made our land use system in Oregon better. It's beginning to restore the trust and the partnership between landowners and the planning system. And this is all we're asking in Senate Bill 305 before the state legislature. Compensation. This is what our bill is about. Our bill is not something out of the mainstream. On the contrary, with the Supreme Court decision and the recent overwhelming support in the U.S. House of Representatives, property rights are the mainstream. I cite the Dolan case because it is a compensation case which has gotten the most publicity. But there are hundreds, perhaps even thousands, more that were, unfortunately, not fixed by the Dolan decision. Many cases just as bad, or in many cases worse, but of which you hear little about. Take the case of another OIA supporter. This family owns 8 acres in Northwest Skyline Boulevard. A son wanted to build a home for him and his mother, but unfortunately they couldn't get a permit. You see, the city had placed an environmental protection overlay on their property, which means they cannot build a home they'd hoped for. Today, they can't even clear the blackberry bushes on their own property. All of this land, understand, is inside, not outside the urban growth boundary of the city of Portland. Requiring this family to leave this area as a natural area to benefit the public without payment is unfair and unjust. We're not asking Salem to gut any of Oregon's land use planning laws. We're asking Salem to restore some balance and some common sense to land use planning. Take our bill to designate so-called secondary lands. I believe that we are right to help Jim Watts. 13 years ago, Jim Watts bought 40 acres in rural Deschutes County. At the time he bought it, he could build a home. And then the rules changed. I believe that now he would like to go in for a home, to build his home, but the county says no. Deschutes County says no because the state land use regulators have forced the counties across the state to zone 97% of all private rural land as either exclusive farm or exclusive forest. 97%. Regardless of its productivity, its soil type, its climate, its availability of irrigation water. 97%. Now, this is going to get confusing, but let me just run through some numbers briefly with you. Of the approximately over 60 million acres in Oregon, about 55% of them are publicly owned, so they're automatically off bounds. Of the 26 million acres of privately owned rural land in this state, about 25 million are zoned exclusive farm or exclusive forest. Of the 16 million acres that are zoned for exclusive farm use, only 5 million, less than a third, is actually cropland. That's land that's cultivated. And of that, less than 2 million are considered prime by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is the prime that was mentioned in Senate Bill 100 in 1973 that was to be protected. Today, the land use system says Jim Watt land is zoned exclusive forest land and therefore unbuildable. But that's wrong. You see, a professional forester from the state came out and surveyed Jim's land, and they've concluded that it has no forest value. Folks, I've been out to Jim's property, and the state forester was correct. The state forester said it's unlikely the land could ever sustain forest growth. Instead, Jim's property, according to the forester, is nothing more than juniper, rock, and sagebrush. Yet Jim can't build on his property, and he also can't farm it, and now he can't sell it. Or as Jim said to me at one time, all I'm left with is the deed and the property taxes to pay. But this tragedy is happening to families all over Oregon. Although the public already owns 55% of the land, as I mentioned, which, may I add, will never have homes built on it, the state is now telling people they can't live on their own land. Another example, 3 years ago, the Petersons saved up to purchase 80 acres, not too far from our farm in Yamhill County, with a dream of building a home to raise their family and raise their kids in a rural setting of Oregon. One home on 80 acres was all the Petersons wanted. However, the county was forced by the state to say no. You see, since March of last year, the state of Oregon now says that if your land is zoned exclusive farm use, you must prove $80,000 of farm income from that land before you can get a house. $80,000. To quote Mr. Peterson, how can I produce $80,000 in farm income from a rocky hillside? So you know, and I'll make this clear, the secondary lands bill simply corrects obvious miszoning. It removes non-productive lands and less productive lands from these highly restricted farm zones, restoring the original intent of Senate Bill 100. Flexibilities of uses would be allowed, but we are not talking about rural subdivisions in Oregon. In fact, in the Oregonians in Action bill, we spelled out clearly that these areas would remain rural. If our bill passes, once land is designated secondary, it would be taken out of the farm and forest goals. But understand, this is the important thing, all the other 17 statewide land use goals, planning goals, would still apply to that land. assuring that we would not have urban uses in rural areas, and assuring we would have adequate public services. This provides a balance to promote the livability of our state by maintaining rural areas while still providing the diversity of lifestyles enjoyed by so many Oregonians. Oregonians in Action's agenda is simple: to support balanced, flexible, and fair land use regulations and respect and provide protection for the rights of property owners. In conclusion, I would like to briefly discuss Metro's 2040 plan, because I believe the plan speaks to the heart of the conflict in the state over what the future of our state will look like. It is a debate over the different visions for the state of Oregon. The question is whether the developing Metro plan is what people really want. I'd be less than honest with you if I told you I know exactly how the people of the state of Oregon want to live, but I know what they don't want. And it bothers me that such groups as Thousand Friends is so determined to pursue an agenda which is so unpopular with such a large number of citizens of the state of Oregon. Their vision of Oregon is no single-family homes in a rural setting. They want Oregon to live in high-density, crowded cities and high-rise apartments, where only the wealthy then can choose to decide what their lifestyle will be. According to one of their recent guest speakers, their vision also includes traffic jams to force people out of their cars. And what is the human cost of that vision? In our view, the human cost of their vision is the loss of choice, loss of freedom, and loss of quality of life. It also means the Petersons, Jim Watts, and thousands of other Oregonians won't be able to live on their land. Well, that's not our vision. It is not the agenda of our supporters. It is not the mainstream agenda. It is not a constitutional agenda, and I don't think it's the agenda of the majority of Oregonians. Most of all, it's not the kind of agenda that will truly make Oregon a great place to live. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I want to thank the City Club for presenting me with this opportunity to alert you to what's happening in the Oregon Legislature, the threat to 20 years of planning, and explain our views on land use planning and growth management and contrast those with the views of Oregonians in Action. As of Tuesday, there are more than 40 bills, including about a half dozen from Oregonians in Action, that would repeal or cripple key provisions of Oregon's planning program. More hostile legislation has been introduced this week. Taken together, as their sponsors intend, they would gut the land use planning laws that have helped keep Oregon, Oregon. Oregonians believe in those laws. 3 times, 1976, 1978, and 1982, they firmly, decisively rejected initiatives that would have repealed the land use laws. Now the legislature is trying to do what the citizens have refused to do. Under each of the 3 topics we were asked to address, I'm going to present Oregonians in Action's views as represented by legislation that they have drafted and had introduced into the 1995 legislature, contrast them with our organization's views, and then present views of others on those subjects. Let's begin with the question of compensation. Senate Bill 305 was drafted by Oregonians in Action and introduced in the Senate early in the session. Let's be very clear about this. This is not a bill to compensate people for what the U.S. Supreme Court has called takings. It is to compensate people for things which the U.S. Supreme Court has said are not takings. That's made clear in Section 5. That should be obvious. Why would you need legislation to do what the U.S. Constitution requires? What does Senate Bill 305 do? Well, it applies to all regulations which would prevent the use of all or part of a property for farming, forestry, mining, or building a house or other structure if the regulations are for the purpose of protecting aesthetic values, wildlife habitat, scenic views and sites, watersheds, wetlands, cultural sites, or historic landmarks. Compensation under the bill as introduced would be paid if the value of the property was diminished by any such regulations applied, not new regulations, existing regulations, after January 1st of next year. Now, the targets of this bill are obvious. They would apply to forest practice regulations, wetland and wildlife protection ordinances, landscaping ordinances, regulations protecting Indian burial grounds, historic ordinances, and protection of landmarks. Here's an illustration of what would happen under the bill. If you had 5 acres and there was a ½ acre of wetland and a ½ acre of an Indian burial site on it that couldn't be used under those regulations, and you could only build 32 houses instead of 40, you'd be entitled to compensation. But there's some less obvious consequences of the bill. Why do we have setback provisions between buildings? Open space, aesthetic reasons. How about building height limitations, whether they're downtown office buildings or buildings in your neighborhood? Those are to protect aesthetic concerns. That would mean under this bill that after January 1 of next year, your neighbor could build up to the property line. And if you said that's a violation of the ordinance requiring setbacks, they would say, pay me. Otherwise, I don't have to obey the law. Now, what are our views? We support the U.S. Constitution. We believe property rights are an important basis for freedom in this country. We have no problem with deferring to the Supreme Court's interpretation of the Constitution, including the case of Dolan v. City of Tigard, which represents an important but overall rather minor adjustment in existing law. We oppose this bill as irresponsible. It singles out a certain class of property, land, provides compensation to the holders of that land under other circumstances, or under circumstances which would not be applied to other property owners. If you own stock in a company that mines coal, and a regulation is adopted that prohibits the burning of high sulfur coal to protect public health and safety, the value of your stock goes down. Should you be compensated? In addition, we think that the bill represents a rather devious approach to the fundamental problem. If Oregonians in action believes that the E-zone in Portland or other regulations are unfair, then they should ask the local government to change them. Or they can ask the legislature to pass a law prohibiting regulations that would protect open space or wildlife habitat or archaeological sites or landmarks. Everyone knows that there isn't enough money to pay compensation. No local government is going to pay compensation under this bill. The real objective of the bill is to prohibit those regulations. If they wish to do that, why don't they do it in a straightforward, direct way by asking local governments to repeal those ordinances? And of course, it fails to compensate people who are affected by changes in regulations that decrease property value. When zoning is changed to allow a gravel pit, that depresses property values nearby, often very significantly. Oregonians in Action bill says nothing about compensating those landowners for that government effect. And what about compensating taxpayers? When you build an interchange and it's your money that pays for it, property values skyrocket. But you're not going to be paid back even though you created that value. I think the underlying assumptions and philosophy are mistaken. We believe that zoning and regulation helps maintain property values overall, including regulations that protect aesthetic concerns. Yes, Senate Bill 305 reflects Oregonians in Action's emphasis on price and the individual rather than value and community. You can know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Here's what others think. The Oregon Forest Industry Council does not support their bill. The Medford Mail Tribune said, "Are there any easy answers? No. Least of all the simplistic cry from legislators and lobbyists about protecting developers and speculators' property rights. Who's lobbying to protect the property rights of those who will have to pay for all the sprawl? Isn't it taxation without representation if current residents are forced to increase taxes to pay for the streets, schools, and quality of life to finance this new unfettered development?" On the subject of urban growth management, profound differences between our organizations. House Bill 2114, drafted by and introduced at the request of Oregonians in Action, would strip LCDC of its authority to require or oversee urban growth boundaries. This is what Frank Nims this is how Frank Nims has described apartment buildings and other multifamily residences: rabbit hutches and breeding boxes. Yes, breeding boxes. Now, a lot of Oregonians can't afford to buy a nice house on a suburban lot. We believe they ought to have the opportunity to buy and live in an apartment. Dorothy Cofield, OIA attorney, has described what Metro has planned as Manhattan-style densities. Now, transportation. Oregonians in Action supports the proposed Western Bypass, a 4-lane highway which would travel through farm and forest land outside the urban growth boundary between Tigard and Hillsborough. What are our views? We support urban growth boundaries. We believe that they save both land and property taxes. A few years ago, the New Jersey legislature commissioned a fiscal impact study, and they asked what would happen if they adopted a statewide plan that would use 1/2 the amount of land for the new development over the next 20 years as opposed to the amount of land they would use if trends continued. This is what they concluded. Savings in infrastructure, $1.3 billion. Annual savings to schools and municipalities, $440 million. So we think urban growth boundaries are a critical tool in protecting our quality of life. About density. I grew up 2 blocks from what is now Beaumont Middle School. That's an area of 5,000 square foot lots. My mother and I could walk to the store, I walked to school, and I walked to the park. I now live in Northwest Portland. I live in a 4-plex. I can walk to the store, I'm 2 blocks from a transit stop, I'm 1 block from a park. These are successful neighborhoods. The prices paid to live in them are testimony to that. That's the kind of community we support, and that's the kind of community Metro envisages, not Manhattan. In fact, a large share of new housing on our Metro's plan would be on 6,500 square foot lots. So we believe in choice. Finally, on transportation, we oppose the Western Bypass. It's a boondoggle. And that is proven not by statements about philosophy, but by the figures prepared by the Oregon Department of Transportation, which show that the bypass really serves as a substitute for the arterial grid that has not been built in Washington County, that people will drive outside the urban area to get on the bypass for a few miles and then come back in to avoid the congestion caused by poor local planning. It's $1/3 billion, and it's an investment in transportation strategy which has proven a dismal failure in Los Angeles, in Seattle, and everywhere else. We don't need it. Here's what others say. This is a statement, part of a statement issued by the Bank of America, which we all know to be a fiery voice of radicalism. California needs to be smarter about how it grows. Quote, it needs to invent ways to create compact and efficient growth patterns that are responsive to the needs of people at all income levels and also help maintain California's quality of life and economic competitiveness. Finally, on conserving farm and forest lands. House Bill 2117, Oregonians in Action Secondary Lands Bill, would allow 83% of the farmland in Oregon be designated secondary. 50% of the private forest land to be designated secondary, including millions of acre forest land, which the federal government classifies as prime forest land. Now, it sounds appealing to say, well, we only need to protect the prime farmland. But in fact, that's only that 13%. It does not include the pear orchards that you see off to the left of I-5 in Jackson County. It doesn't include the vineyards in Yamhill County. It doesn't include the grass seed lands. And it doesn't include the lands used for one of Oregon's top agricultural commodities, cattle. With regard to forest land, at a time when people are complaining about timber supplies, does it make sense to take 1/2 of the private forest land base and open it up for development? Now, Oregonians in Action says that their bill will keep these lands rural. It's not what it says. It says uses, any use that is not, quote, urban may be allowed on those properties. It has no definition of urban. Now, does that mean 1.5 acre lots? It certainly means gravel pits, and it means commercial facilities of a rural character, I guess, some industrial uses. If that bill is passed, you won't be able to tell where the urban growth boundary ends. The bill doesn't give any consideration to the consequences of this development on groundwater supplies, forest fires, and the cost of services. House Bills 2115 and 2116 would eliminate LCDC's authority to regulate houses and farm zones and land divisions in farm and forest zones. We have a very different view of farm and forest zones. We think of them as industrial zones, which provide employment for 100,000 Oregonians. Like industrial zones, there are a lot of activities there that are noisy or dangerous, that use chemicals, and it's not a good place to site a house. We have a fundamental difference as well about what's happening in those areas. Oregonians in Action believes that there are not enough houses being built in farm and forest lands and not enough new lots being created. There are thousands of houses being approved every several years by counties. There are thousands of houses already in farm and forest zones. In Washington County, which ranks 5th in gross farm sales, there's one house for every 33 acres right now, even though there's only the commercial farm size is 200 acres. There are 122,000 people expected to move into Washington County in the next 15 or 20 years. If a quarter of them wanted to live on 15 acres in the country, that would use up all of the land in farm use zoning today. About the gross farm sales test, Mr. George didn't tell you that's gross sales of $80,000. That translates into an income of $14,000, poverty level. The farmers we know and work with do not begin the business of farming by building a house. They buy property that has a house on it. What would you think of someone who wanted to borrow money and said to start up a software company and said most of it was going to be used to build their house? What do others say about Oregonians in Action's bills on farm and forest land? Here's the Pendleton East Oregonian. No wonder the Oregon Farm Bureau, usually a friend of Republicans, has come out against this attack on the farm economy. Other farm groups need to do the same. Legislators need to be told to quit wasting taxpayers' time and money on this fringy radicalism. The Daily Historian said, February, the land use bills proposed by Oregonians in Action, quote, deserve a quiet burial. The Capital Press, which is the farmers' newspaper, said, what a crazy thing to do when many egg producers in the Willamette Valley and elsewhere in western Oregon are face to face with bulldozers, construction cranes, and cement mixers. The Oregon Farm Bureau Federation, which Mr. George is a member, so he knows this, had a long internal debate. They oppose these bills. They haven't been endorsed by the Forest Industries Council, and we know that business leaders here in the metro area are very concerned about them. To conclude, I know that land use can be very complicated, but it is not complicated to figure out what needs to be done. Oregonians in Action thinks that the kind of approach and the pattern of development in California, Washington, and New Jersey is just fine. That's why they want to pick apart, repeal, or hobble the laws that have sent us in a different direction. We think California or New Jersey style growth is not good enough for Oregon. We think that opinion is shared by the vast majority of Oregonians who want to keep this place a place they're proud to call home. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan Stone will have the first question.
Thank you. What Oregonians in Action sees as fair, flexible, and balanced, 1,000 Friends sees as gutting our effective land use system. Our City Club's premier issue for the next 5 years is rebuilding community, and I'd like to ask both our speakers, is there a way to start healing this growing rift, or is it just going to keep escalating?
I really do think that there is a huge amount of area that we can work with different groups. Just recently, a number of county farm bureaus have put forth bills that were compromises from our bills. And we're looking at those very seriously and working with those folks and coming up together with something that is compromises. And I think that's what the political process is all about. In working together, we find better answers. And I think what's been frustrating for landowners across Oregon is that we get a lot of rhetoric, but what you end up with is a very abusive system. And what we need to do is find those areas where we can work together, and I think they're there. And you know, on Senate Bill 305, the compensation bill, I really think that, you know, obviously I know the Forest Industry Council didn't support our bill because they had their own bill that compensated landowners, so that's why they didn't support us. But the point is that a lot of groups came together and started putting some good ideas together. And that kind of dialogue, that kind of discussion, the kind of discussion we're having here today, which is really one of the first of its kind, is really important in developing the future of Oregon and what we're going to look like. all of us have a different vision of what we want. And all of us have a different vision of how we want to live. And the importance is to realize that we're all very different. And then how do we plan for what you want, and how do I plan for what I want? Now, I'm fortunate enough to live on the farm, so it's no big deal. I can live out there, and all of you can live in town, as far as I'm concerned. But you know, for us on the farm, we have a lot of non-farm neighbors in Newburgh. And those people are very dear to us, and they live on lands that we wouldn't farm. And I don't have a problem with them raising their kids out there. So I think there is a lot of room for us to work together.
I think the rift has been created by 10 years of assaults on a planning program that has been endorsed by Oregonians 3 times at the polls. No other planning program in the United States has that kind of record of public support. Polling that we have done and the Oregon Business Planning Council has done shows wide and deep support for the planning program and very high levels of concern about what growth is doing to our quality of life. Compromise sounds good, but when you're talking about compromising laws to protect our quality of life, I'm not sure that's what Oregonians want. We think the bills that have been drafted and introduced by Oregonians in Action are extreme and they're dangerous, and we will fight them.
David Cooper as the second question.
I'd like to ask a question of both of you with respect to the compensation and takings issue. Is it Mr. Chance? Is that correct? Right?
George.
George.
Just like the first name.
Great. I think I know your answer to the first question, which would be, is compensation to private property owners the most effective way to strike the balance that you spoke of with respect to public and private interests in special restrictions on land for environmental reasons? I'd like to know why you think it's the most effective way. And then for Mr. Liberty, I'd like to know what you think, or how you would state broadly what the most effective way is to strike that balance.
I think it's really important to understand that we all have a stake in the quality of life of the state of Oregon. And when we pass a regulation that impacts an individual property owner, we're doing it for the benefit of all of us. And unfortunately, what happens is that if we want something, typically, if we want a park, and like Metro Green Space's ballot measure, which is up, which is a superb proposal, what that says is we want to. What it says is we want to take these parcels of land under public ownership so that we can own these pieces. But what I guess the easiest way to explain it is Multnomah County had a proposal about 2 years ago where they said, well, we understand that under the natural areas, we're not going to be able to take everything under public ownership, so therefore we use zoning laws to achieve the same means. And I think what's important is that somebody is bearing the cost. There is a landowner out there who has just taken a loss when you decide that as a community we should have this resource. But the fact of the matter is that landowner is part of the community, and he'll pay his fair share too. It's just that if we all want it, then we should all pay for it. And I really, I live in Tigard, and I have absolutely no problem with paying all the landowners along Fano Creek to create a very beautiful greenway. And that is part of building a strong partnership. And if we want to alienate property owners, well, then I think you're going to have a process that continues to have a lot of conflict.
Whenever a regulation affects property owners, you have to be very sensitive to whether it's a fair or inappropriate burden placed on them. I worked for a year and a half as a hearings officer for Multnomah County hearing land use cases. And I've represented clients in private practice during the period when I wasn't at 1,000 Friends. I think that local officials, planning commissions, and the legislature are very sensitive to effects on property. I know many cases both in this city and around the state where regulations have been changed because people presented convincing evidence that they weren't fair, they weren't fairly administered. I think that's appropriate. I think we need to be very careful. And I think that's the system we have, and I think it works fine.
City Club member David Brownell, a question for Mr. Liberty. Senate Bill 613 states that the land use limits state land use program to matters of statewide concern. It requires the LCDC to repeal or amend goals and rules that are not of statewide concern. The bill defines, quote, matters of statewide concern, unquote, and excludes a number of subjects contained in the goals of the LCDC, for example, urbanization. Couldn't this legislation have a major impact on urban growth boundaries?
Absolutely, and as a matter of fact, I believe Senate Bill 613 is the twin of House Bill 2114, which was drafted and introduced by Oregonians in Action. The things that, as we read the bill, would be excluded from oversight by the Land Conservation Development Commission would include such things as the Western Bypass, because it's a facility that begins and ends in a single county. We think maybe it wasn't intended, but as the bill is drafted, it would eliminate any role for LCDC in determining standards for setting urban growth boundaries. It really is an effort to undo the heart of the planning program. And in terms of original intention, it was Hector McPherson was the co-sponsor of Senate Bill 100. He's written a letter about what their intention was. And what they wanted was a balance between a broad public perspective expressed in statewide planning goals and local implementation. And 2114, or Senate Bill 613, undoes that original arrangement.
Briefly on that, Thousand Friends of Oregon knows this. We brought this bill up as a concept bill because Senate Bill 100 clearly lays out that there shall be those matters of statewide concern. And so a lot of people said to us, why don't you bring a bill that tries to focus in what is causing the problems between the state and the local? I understand the process that was set up was a bottom-up process in 1973, and a lot of people have felt like that got flipped upside down. And we put the proposal up, and after talking to a variety of groups, in fact, I've met with DLCD, the staff down for the department, talking to them about this bill, and Thousand Friends set through our testimony, and we have currently have this bill off of the table, and we are working on amendments with a variety of different people. The concept is so important, and this bill is a first draft at something that may take a number of years to refine our planning system. And I don't think it is a problem to look at ourselves and say, are we planning correctly? I think it is so important to be able to say, are we headed the right direction? Are we going the right way? And to automatically just throw up a brick wall to anybody who is trying to improve the land use system and just throw up a brick wall is really disturbing. It shows a lack of flexibility. And understand, planning, by definition, is willing to change with the future. 613 is off the table. We're working on it. It's going to come back. And what we're going to start doing is talking about some things we don't want DLCD to do, which a lot of people think that'll be easier. And Thousand Friends is more than invited to work with us on that, because I'm sure that they also see problems. And this is another situation where I believe we are wide open to discussion, because we are only in the initial stages of planning for the future of Oregon. And it is so important that we don't close the doors to certain segments of our population.
I want to say something about flexibility, because this charge is often laid at the feet of the planning program that it's inflexible. Every biennium, there are 4,000 plan amendments at the local level in this state. 4,000 amendments to local plans and regulations. In terms of flexibility of the planning program, the last session legislature passed in a single bill 33 pages of changes. Our problem is not with flexibility, it's with having enough spine to make the program work.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. It seems to me that the discussion is primarily about the vision of the future and how we're going to accommodate growth, particularly in urban areas. And I can't help but refer to what Bob Liberty said about his younger days. And the question is, can the density that we have experienced in the city of Portland, if applied to the entire urban growth boundary, can that density, which by the way is mostly single-family dwellings, can that density accommodate the future growth that is expected? In other words, can we contain future growth within the urban growth boundary, if we don't agree that we will have the suburban type of development, the suburban type of space, instead of the urban city of Portland type of space?
I think that's what Metro's model is predicated on. It assumes that there'll be a generous share, because that's what the market needs and requires, of multifamily or townhouses, and it also has a generous share of single-family residential development. I think we can build it, and I think people will want to live in those communities more than they want to live in the communities that are being built elsewhere. I had the privilege of attending a groundbreaking on Friday last for a new project in Fairview, and the project developers are here in the audience today, that's going to try and rebuild, rediscover that former kind of community and neighborhood that I think will continue to make us an attractive place to live. Now, of course, there's a downside. The more we succeed, the more people want to move here, and the greater the challenge. Unfortunately, the solution, as Mike Burton has mentioned, is that we can wreck everything and then no one will want to move here, but we'll be leaving too.
I think projects like what Mr. Liberty talked about is so important, because there are people who do want to live in those kind of places, and when we plan for them, it's going to be great. But there's also people who want to live in different kinds of communities, in different kinds of neighborhoods, and that's shown by the price of homes in certain of our areas around the city. Obviously, a house in Northeast Portland is different than a price of a home in Lake Oswego. And the importance is to realize that, and this is totally a cheap shot, but last night I was watching the news, and Portland has become one of the least affordable cities to buy a home in. Now, there's a variety of reasons besides land use planning and those kind of things. But I'm saying is that we need to understand, if we had a perfect land use system, not only would we have really inexpensive homes in this area, but I also wouldn't have to sit in traffic jams on 217 and I-5. Because when I was young, and I used to come in, well, I still am, but when I was younger, and I used to come into Tiger to watch movies, I didn't have traffic. And that was when the land use planning system was in place. And so why do I have to sit in traffic jams now if the land use system is perfect? Obviously, we've got problems, and obviously there's a variety of different ways we can head with it. And a lot of this is based on a concept of, like, I heard one time, like plumbing, which is you can put a process together, you can put the plumbing all together, but until you actually fill it with water, you don't know where your leaks are. And what we need to do is make sure we keep an open mind. Can we keep an open mind? And because when that rush of water comes, if we have leaks, we need to be able to plug them. And we need to be able to figure out how to let people grow and how to let people have the market they want.
Larry, it makes me nervous when you compare brains to plumbing and leaks, but I may have water on my mind. I want to respond with some figures to the National Association of Home Builders and the price of homes in other communities that don't have urban growth boundaries, and some of them don't even have planning. In the third quarter of 1994, the average price of a home in Portland, in the Portland metro area, and that's new and existing homes, was $118,000. The same period in Las Vegas, $121,000. We know how tight their urban growth boundaries are. Albuquerque, $130,000. Denver, $130,000. Sacramento, $136,000. Seattle, $145,000. And San Jose, capital of rigid socialistic-style planning, $223,000. Affordable housing is a serious concern for our organization, for the region. We need to address it. Busting the urban growth boundary is not the answer.
Those areas, though, and granted, I set up my comment with the fact that there's a lot of factors weren't included, and also in your comments, there's a lot of factors that are not included. Some of those areas are in very high demand. Those population centers are huge, and they have absorbed huge numbers of population increase that even Oregon hasn't experienced. And I think it's interesting to see that for 15 years we had a planning system, and we had very little growth because of the economy. And over the last 5 years, all of a sudden we've had growth, and we're all panicking. And we just need to be aware that perhaps we're fallible, and that's the recognition that needs to happen. And of course, I'm a farm boy, so a lot of these metro issues, I look at them and say, okay, you guys can live how you want, but I think it's important. I live close enough I can walk to work, and that's what the whole system is supposed to set up to do. I can walk to Oregonians in Action from my apartment, but that doesn't mean that's the way I want to live for the rest of my life.
And I want to say that I concur that the system needs fine-tuning. It will always need fine-tuning. We will always need to be plugging leaks. And I am willing to admit right here that I am fallible.
Consensus already.
I wonder if either of you could speak to the question, which is very evident today: why is it that only white people are concerned about these things? For our radio audience, I'd like to remark there are about 250 people in this room. One of those persons is a person of color. And of the people who are here, even more than is typical for a City Club meeting, we are rather frighteningly overly male and white. Would you talk about that?
I would be glad to address that, even though I am male and white. Yeah. I don't know whether that reflects the City Club, but I'm pretty confident it does not reflect concerns in the African American community or other communities. I know that because Thousand Friends is a partner in a coalition that includes representatives of communities of color and affordable housing advocates. It's called the Coalition for a Livable Future. We think one of the worst phenomena in metropolitan growth in other parts of the country is how not only central cities, but inner suburbs become sinks of poverty due in part to bad planning. And that when those ghetto areas form, and a ghetto is an area of intense poverty, regardless of race, there is a rapid movement out of both people, middle class, and also property values. Those people and then ultimately jobs flee to wealthier suburbs, and you have a cycle that starts with increasing social needs but decreasing property tax base to pay the cost of those in the central city and nearby suburbs, and then the opposite phenomenon in the suburbs. And you have regions pulling apart. You have a donut region, which is dying. The social and economic fabric is dying at the heart, and the natural environment is dying at the perimeter. That's what you see in a lot of cities. We don't want that here. And I think one of the important things that our organization has to do, and others, is to make sure that there is a lot of discussion about those issues, that representatives of communities of color, the poor, have an opportunity to express their perspectives on these issues. That happened, by the way, in November, at the end of November, when representatives of many of those groups spoke and testified before the Metro Council on the 2040 plan. That's why we think the 2040 plan, or the growth concept, needs to be improved by addressing affordable housing issues on a regional basis. And I'm pleased to say that the Future Vision Commission, on which I serve along with some other people here in the room today, have identified the concentration of poverty, which is correlated with racial segregation as well, is an issue of metropolitan concern. So maybe if you have Representative Myron Orfield come to speak to you, although he is another white male, I think you would find that there is a rising level of concern about planning and its role in making a more just community.
I mean, I think it's very obvious that the most important thing with Oregon's land use planning system, and one excellent part about it is that it has an important component, that's citizen involvement. And all citizens need to be represented at the table, and that really is an important thing, and I must agree with what Robert said.
It looks like we're time for a quick question.
All
Make
right.
it real quick, please.
Ken Brody, City Club member. A compensation question for Robert Liberty. In the Lucas case, the parties agreed that the regulation of the South Carolina Coastal Commission had deprived the owner of 100% or all the value of his land, and the court held that he should be compensated. Now, in a similar case, if it were agreed that the regulation deprived the owner of 75% of his bought and paid for value, do you believe that he should be compensated? And I would ask the same question at a 50% and at a 25% level.
Let's see if we can do that.
Right. The answer is no. We think that the issues of fairness of regulations and the burdens they impose need to be addressed at the Planning Commission level, not at the Supreme Court level.
I think it's just part of a movement that's growing I think I've heard that property rights are the civil rights of the 1990s. It's really important to realize that the court is moving in the direction towards what the question was asking, which is there's a partial takings, and Lucas was in 1992, and the American Planning Association and groups such as Thousand Friends opposed that, and the Supreme Court came in favor of the property owner, and they also opposed compensation to the Dolans here in Tigard, and the Supreme Court came in favor of that, and eventually a partial takings case, I believe, will come up, and I do believe that the Supreme Court will hold that the community is responsible for what the community benefits.
I'd add that the Lucas property at times in the past had been inundated by the ocean. Well, that's why there was a prohibition on building there. So the owner bought land that was subject to inundation, ocean flooding, and then decided that after the regulation went into effect that he was entitled to be paid for having bought property where the property value might be altered not by government but by Mother Nature.
I'd also make a note real quick that once the state had to buy the property for Mr. Lucas and they didn't have to pay for it, when they actually had the deed, they turned around and sold it because they couldn't afford to hold the piece of property. So it's okay for Mr. Lucas to bear the cost, but it's not okay for the state of South Carolina to hold the cost.
And I'm no apologist for the state of South Carolina.
Perhaps we can finish this discussion downstairs in the lobby, but thank you very much, Mr. George and Mr. Liberty. We're adjourned.